Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting our group to present at this symposium. Everybody can hear me fine with the mask? All good? Okay, great. So what I would like to highlight today is both recent research effort as well as a longer-term vision geared towards having a better understanding of climate impacts on California coastal ecosystems and resources and what kind of solutions we can come up to have climate resilience strategies for those ecosystems. So if you believe recent scientific studies, climate change has had quite an impact on harmful algal blooms, species distribution along the coast of California. And those effects don't stop at the ecosystem, but they also extend to livelihood and economies. For example, here with the Dungeness crab fisheries that was closed because of a toxic algal bloom. And those effects may actually be disproportionately impacting tribal communities or native communities that relied more heavily on those resources. So one way we can understand how climate change is affecting coastal ecosystem is by looking at the past state and observations. But if we're trying to understand the future evolution, then we need to rely on numerical models. And you may have heard of those models. Those are called global climate projection, and it's used by the entire IPCC. And we know now at the global scale that a warming world, a world where the ocean are progressively becoming more acidified, and a world where the ocean are losing oxygens are all going to be stressors for coastal regions. Unfortunately, it would be tempting to just say, look at this plot and say by 2050 there will be so much warming or so much acidification of so much oxygen loss. But unfortunately, those global predictions do not necessarily apply to specific coastal regions. And it's actually the case for the California current system where we live, the ocean that's just out here, is that the way, for example, acidification is going to impact the ecosystem is very non-spatially uniform. So some regions in red are going to see a faster progression towards more acidified condition, and other regions not. And furthermore, those regions that might see faster acidification, so more stressful environment for organisms, are also the regions where we tend to observe more frequent and more intense harmful algal blooms. So there's a possibility here for toxins and acidification and warming to all combine each other, if not amplify each other. So one way that we have to understand the future evolution is the system is actually to use those global climate models, but run them at the scale of the California current or the west coast of the United States. So on the left here is a model simulation that I developed here in collaboration with partners at NOAA that shows you how pH is going to evolve through the century along the west coast of the United States, and especially California. And don't worry too much about the details, but when it gets really red, it gets pretty bad for the organisms that are sensitive to ocean acidification. And also to show you the scale at which those changes are happening, the bottom is comparing Monterey Bay and Año Nuevo, which are about 50 kilometers apart from each other. So even though they're following the same trend with becoming more and more acidified, Año Nuevo is actually getting acidified faster than Monterey Bay. So at the scale of 50 kilometers, you could have Año Nuevo being half of the year detrimental to organism, whereas Monterey Bay not so much. And this is why we need to do those high-resolution projections. So going back to our host of problems, how do we find solution? So the approach that we're advocating here is our group is to sort of look at this in a more holistic way and say that we have stressors, warming, acidification, loss of oxygen. This is potentially affecting harmful algal blooms, their occurrence toxicity, which has an effect on species, and then ultimately has socioeconomic impact. So what we're suggesting here is that a way to approach this and find solution is to start with laboratory and field experiment. We need to know how those organisms respond to those conditions. But then we would move to those regional climate projection, and obviously those laboratory experiments can inform the projection. And what we gain from doing this is that we can actually now predict the future evolution of pH, of oxygen, of temperature, which then feeds into doing new lab experiments, new observation, to understand how those organisms may react to a new climate in the future. And then that feeds back into model, and then models can inform all those different boxes that you see on the screen, the stressors, the HABs, the ecosystem, the ecological and socioeconomic impact. And so what we're arguing for here is an approach of iterative ecological forecasting where model and observation go hand in hand to try to find solution for those problems. So in the short term, our group here, our core group, has actually all the expertise to address this problem. And this is, again, a combination of experimental work and climate projections. And in collaboration with the Institute of Marine Sciences, here also at UCSC, we can look at species distribution changes, and we can look at fisheries impact and socioeconomic impact. And with partners at other academic institutions, NOAA and Senkus, so those are local entities involved in this type of research, we can actually probably within a couple of years start making improved prediction of where and when and how strong or how severe those ocean acidification and toxic event will happen. And not just that, but we can actually take it faster and look at ecosystem ramification of those events and potentially start looking at management strategies. For example, instead of closing an entire Dungeness crab fishery, now we can do targeted closure of that fisheries in response to that spatial variability in toxicity or acidification or warming. And what we would like to do as well is try to develop what we call an ecological forecasting web portal, which would be essentially a centralized access point for coastal climate prediction for California. And this would be a way that resource managers, scientists can access and use and visualize all those climate projection, all those experiments. And eventually, we would also make customized product for certain stakeholders and resource managers. So that's kind of the short-term view of where this is going. But to give you a little bit of a long-term vision that integrates into the Coastal Resilience Initiative here at UC Santa Cruz, what we're dealing with here is a framework where we have driver pressures that affect the state of the ocean and the ecosystem, which then has consequences and impacts, and we need to find responses to those impacts. And there's actually a lot of knowledge and expertise already available here at UCSC, and don't worry about all those acronyms. Those represent different departments at the university, ocean sciences, but the point is that in terms of the green activities, the drivers, pressures, we already have a lot of expertise. We have some expertise in looking at species distribution and exposure, but where we could build capacity in the future is to work more on the fisheries management side, incorporating traditional knowledge, so all the part that goes with responses and policy making. And those projections involve a lot of different components. It involves temperature, it involves species, it involves fisheries impact. So I think a great deal could be done in collaboration with computational media here at UCSC to improve the way we visualize and communicate those results and having different layers that are easily accessible for managers. And so my last slide here is that how does that fit within a Center for Coastal Climate Resilience at UCSC? Well, I think any Center for Coastal Climate Resilience should at least look at that framework in terms of the drivers and the impact and the responses. And we think that regional ecological forecasting should be an important part of that center because it can inform all those boxes that you see, but it also gives you a framework to test the responses. So if you do a fishery closure here or there, how does that then feed back into that loop going from driver to responses? And then the final point is that we could actually build a hub on ecological forecasting here, and that would improve capacity building, that would allow us to recruit students that can be the next generation of coastal climate scientists and policymakers. We could offer fellowships that are at the boundaries of the social sciences, economics, and science. And also, I think we can leverage an expanding, my time is up, the coastal science and policy program here at UCSC that has been doing a tremendous job kind of bridging that gap between science and policy. Thank you very much.